Dear students, greetings to all. In this module, there is the second session of biology dealing up with chapter 1. We were dealing up with chapter 1, that is the living world. Now in the last class, we had discussed about what is meant by animate and inanimate. Today, we are going to talk about the criterion which helps to distinguish the animate from the inanimate. So criterion or the criteria which is used to distinguish the animate objects from the inanimate one. Okay, so the animate, that means the living, from the inanimate, that means the non-living moieties. Now, the properties which help us to distinguish, the first we are going to talk about, that is we are going to deal with growth. Now, how do you define growth, or what do you understand by the term growth? So, growth refers to increment in the size, it refers to the increase in the mass, or it also refers to the increment in the number of cells. So, if any moiety is showing any of these characters, that is either there is increase in size, or if there is an increment in mass or the number of cells, then we say that the particular entity is exhibiting growth. Like for example, if we take the examples of Homo sapiens. So in case of Homo sapiens, there is the process of cell cycle, which is referred to as mitosis, which includes mitosis as well as meiosis. So by this process of the cell cycle, a single cell will divide to form 2 cells, 2 will divide to form 4, 4 will divide to form 8, and so on. Thus, the process of multiplication of cells takes place. So that means there is an increase in the number of cells by the process of mitosis and the process of meiosis, so as to maintain the chromosome number. There is also an increase in the size and mass as we start maturing. This is because we undergo growth under the influence of the growth hormone, which is secreted by the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So therefore, organisms like us, that is Homo sapiens, we are living and we exhibit the characteristic that is growth. But when we talk about a boulder or an anthill, which is made up of mud, so in that case also we see that the size of that anthill or that zone which is made up of mud is increasing. Now, here we had said that growth means increase in size or mass. And if there is increase in size, so when we are talking about the anthill, there is also an increase in size. But then we know that when we talk about the soil or the landform, it is not living, right? So we cannot say that those organisms which exhibit growth, they are living. So growth is not just the characteristic feature. It is one among the characteristic feature. Yes, organisms which are living, they exhibit growth. But it is not just the defining character which will help us to differentiate between living and non-living entities. Now the next criteria, the next distinguishing feature which we need to talk about, that is reproduction. Now we know that reproduction is a characteristic feature of living organisms. That means that organisms give birth to offsprings and they are of similar kinds, that is like begets like. It means that the organisms will give birth to offsprings which are similar to them. The genetic constitution will obviously vary in case of sexual reproduction. Now when I talk about reproduction, we know that organisms either reproduce by asexual means or they reproduce by the sexual means. So in case of asexual, a single individual will give rise to offsprings, whereas when we talk about sexual, there is fusion of the male and the female gamete so as to produce the offsprings. So now when I'm talking about reproduction, that means to give birth to organisms similar to its kind. But then let us take few examples like of childless couples. So when we take the example of childless couples, due to it could be because of the reason could be any because of which the couple is unable to bear or give birth to offsprings. But then in that case, they are unable to give birth to offsprings. but then they are living. So here they cannot reproduce, but they are living. Now let us take the other example, that is of a mule, which is produced by the mating of a horse and a donkey. So now that's a product which is obtained when a donkey mates with a horse. But then when we talk about the mule also, in that also, in they are sterile or they are infertile in nature. But then they are living. So just reproduction cannot guarantee, or it does not ensure that the particular organism is living, because there are many organisms, right, like one example, mule, which are living, but they cannot give birth to offsprings. Right? So now the next criteria that will help us to distinguish, that is the response to stimuli, and after that we'll be also discussing about the next criteria. So here first we'll be talking about the response to stimuli. So we'll talk about the next criteria, that is self-consciousness, or you can also refer it to as consciousness. So now when we talk about this consciousness, right, so that refers to the response of an organism to external stimuli. So the response to an external stimuli. Now if we talk about the response to external stimuli, so basically that is brought about by the nervous system if we are talking about Homo sapiens. Like if I give you an example, if I ask you to take out a pen and start writing, so the signal which you perceived that got that was sensed by the ear, you could hear it. The signal was taken with the help of the efferent nerves, the sensory neuron, to the brain. The brain did the processing. The motor neuron got the signal back, and then you started writing. Now, in case of certain patients who are in coma or those who are paralytic, so the nerve cells, they've undergone, they are not responding properly to this stimuli. But then in that case, when a person is in coma, or even if he has undergone paralysis or suffered from a paralytic shock, we cannot say that the person is not living. So now when we talk about consciousness, so self-consciousness as such is a characteristic feature which will help us to differentiate between living and non-living. Because even if a person is in coma, he is responding to the medicines. Whatever the medicines are given to him, he is responding to that. So then in that case, his body is showing response. But there's lack of self-consciousness. So this is again one characteristic feature which help us to distinguish between living and non-living. So we had talked about the growth. We had talked about the response to the stimuli. That is again a characteristic feature. We had talked about reproduction, which is also a characteristic feature which helps to distinguish the living from the non-living. There are many other characters, like for example, we can also take the example of growth. So we had taken the example of growth, we had taken the example of reproduction, we had also taken the example of consciousness, which helps to distinguish the living from the non-living. In the next module, we'll be talking about the binomial system of nomenclature, discussing about the systematics, talking about taxonomy. That was all that was all right now. We'll deal with it, the remaining portion in the next module. Thank you.